Ethan Foster was 6 years old when he first learned the shape of betrayal. It did not arrive with a stranger's face or with a knife in the dark, but in the warm, familiar smile of his mother's own sister, Patricia Shaw, the woman who would come to embody every shattered dream of his childhood. Even now, more than 2 decades later, he could still remember the exact cadence of her voice, the way she would lean in close and speak in honeyed tones that made everyone around her feel chosen, special, seen. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who always brought the perfect gift, whose laughter could fill a room with warmth. And all of it, every gesture, every kind word, every carefully crafted moment of apparent generosity, had been a lie so complete and so devastating that it had destroyed everything Ethan had ever known or loved. The fever had begun as a stubborn, low-grade heat that refused to break, the kind of illness that parents hope will pass with rest and fluids and a few days off from school. Ethan remembered lying in his narrow bed, the sheets tangled around his thin legs, watching the shadows on the ceiling shift and dance as the afternoon sun filtered through the cheap Venetian blinds. His mother, Margaret, had pressed cool washcloths to his forehead and sung him lullabies in her soft, slightly off-key voice, her rough hands gentle against his burning skin. She was a small woman with tired eyes and a spine curved from years of scrubbing other people's floors, but when she looked at her son, there was a fierceness in her gaze that suggested she would fight the entire world to keep him safe. She had no idea then that the enemy she should have feared most was her own flesh and blood. The fever climbed. Night after night, Ethan's small body was racked with chills and sweats, his temperature spiking so high that his mother would carry him to the bathtub and submerge him in tepid water, her lips moving in desperate, silent prayer. The local doctor, a kindly old man with nicotine-stained fingers and a perpetually worried expression, did what he could with the limited resources available in their small Midwestern town. He prescribed antibiotics, then stronger antibiotics. He ordered blood tests, then more specialized blood tests. He referred the Fosters to a pediatric specialist in the next county, who referred them to a research hospital in Chicago, who finally, after weeks of mounting terror and sleepless nights, delivered the diagnosis that shattered what remained of the family's fragile peace. It was a rare autoimmune disorder, the kind of disease that appeared in medical textbooks as a footnote, an anomaly, a statistical improbability. Ethan's immune system was attacking his own organs, and without a highly specialized surgical intervention, a procedure so complex that only a handful of surgeons in the country were qualified to perform it, the damage would be irreversible and ultimately fatal. The good news, the doctors said with a kind of practiced optimism that barely masked their concern, was that the surgery had a high success rate. The bad news was that it was only performed at one hospital, a renowned medical center in Seattle, nearly 2,000 miles away. And the cost was a figure so astronomical that it seemed almost abstract, a number that belonged to a different universe than the one the Foster family inhabited. $70,000. In today's terms, that might not sound like an insurmountable sum, but for a high school janitor and a house cleaner living in a small town in the late 1990s, it might as well have been $70 million. Jonathan Foster, Ethan's father, earned just over $18,000 a year mopping floors, fixing broken toilets, and shoveling snow from the school's sidewalks in the brutal Midwestern winters. Margaret brought in maybe another $10,000 cleaning houses, her hands perpetually cracked and bleeding from the harsh chemicals, her knees worn down from hours spent on bathroom tiles and kitchen floors. They lived in a cramped 2-bedroom bungalow on the wrong side of town, a house with a roof that leaked every spring, a furnace that coughed black smoke every winter, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbors arguing through the plaster. They had a little over $10,000 in savings, accumulated over nearly 2 decades of relentless, back-breaking sacrifice, $1 here, $1 there, birthday money from elderly relatives, tax refunds carefully socked away. A small inheritance from a great-aunt that they had planned to use someday for something nice, something special, something that would give their son a better life than they had known. That savings account was the first thing to go. Margaret withdrew every cent, her hand trembling as she signed the withdrawal slip, the bank teller's sympathetic gaze making her feel somehow more exposed, more vulnerable. Next came the jewelry, Margaret's grandmother's wedding ring, a delicate gold band with a tiny diamond chip, the only heirloom the family had ever possessed. She sold it to a pawnshop for a fraction of its worth, standing at the counter with tears streaming down her face while the pawnbroker, a man who had seen 1,000 such scenes of quiet desperation, counted out the bills with mechanical indifference. Jonathan sold his father's vintage toolbox, a collection of craftsman tools that had been passed down through 2 generations, for $200 to a neighbor who knew he was getting a bargain. They sold the old piano that Margaret had learned to play on as a girl, the one piece of furniture that had always made their threadbare living room feel like a home. They sold Jonathan's truck, their only vehicle, and borrowed Margaret's sister's old sedan for the few essential trips they still needed to make. Then came the loans. Jonathan, a proud man who had never asked anyone for anything, went door to door through the town, his cap clutched in his rough, calloused hands, his eyes fixed on the ground as he explained the situation to neighbors, to distant relatives, to fellow church members, to anyone who might have a little money to spare. He was not a man given to displays of emotion, but more than once, standing on a stranger's doorstep with the autumn wind biting through his thin jacket, his voice cracked and his eyes grew wet. Some people gave generously, moved by the desperation in his face and the unmistakable sincerity of his plea. Others offered only sympathetic murmurs and closed their doors with expressions of relief that they had not been asked for more. A few were openly suspicious, wondering aloud if this was some kind of scam, some elaborate con designed to prey on the goodwill of decent people. Jonathan bore it all, the kindness and the suspicion alike, with the stoic endurance of a man who had long ago learned that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Margaret, meanwhile, organized bake sales and charity drives at their church, standing for hours behind folding tables laden with homemade pies and cookies, her smile fixed and bright despite the exhaustion that ringed her eyes like bruises. The church community rallied around the family with a fervor that was both touching and, in retrospect, heartbreakingly naive. They prayed together, sang hymns together, and contributed whatever they could spare to the collection jar that sat on the church foyer table with a photograph of Ethan taped to its front. A gap-toothed 6-year-old with a mop of unruly brown hair and eyes that sparkled with a life and mischief that the disease was slowly extinguishing. After 3 months of relentless effort, the impossible had been achieved. The Fosters had assembled the full $70,000. The money came in every conceivable form: crumpled $20 bills from waitresses who worked double shifts, checks from retired teachers living on fixed incomes, envelopes of cash from construction workers who had heard about the cause at the local bar. Even a jar of coins collected by the elementary school students, Ethan's classmates, who had emptied their piggy banks and raided their allowances to help save their friend. Jonathan deposited all of it into a single cashier's check, a document that felt almost impossibly heavy in his hands, as if the paper itself was imbued with the collective hopes and sacrifices of an entire community. He brought it home and laid it on the kitchen table, and he and Margaret sat there for a long time, staring at it in silence, neither of them quite able to believe that after everything, after all the fear and the scrambling and the sleepless nights, their son might actually have a chance. It was in that moment of fragile, tentative hope that Patricia Shaw appeared. She drove up to the bungalow in her shiny new sedan, its paint gleaming under the gray November sky, and swept into the house with a flurry of air kisses and exclamations of sisterly concern. Patricia was Margaret's younger sister by 3 years, but in every other respect, she seemed to belong to a completely different species. Where Margaret was plain and hardworking and unassuming, Patricia was glamorous and ambitious and possessed of a charisma that could charm the birds from the trees. She had married Richard Shaw, a small-time contractor with a smooth tongue and even smoother business ethics, and together they had built a life that hovered somewhere on the fringes of the upper middle class, nice enough to impress the neighbors, but not quite nice enough to satisfy Patricia's voracious appetite for more. She wore designer knockoffs that she passed off as originals, drove cars leased beyond her means, and spoke with an affected sophistication that she had cultivated from years of watching daytime talk shows and reading glossy magazines. "Oh, Maggie, you poor thing," Patricia cooed, enveloping her sister in a hug that was just a little too tight, a little too theatrical. "I've been so worried about you. And little Ethan, how is the darling boy? I've been absolutely sick with concern. I haven't been able to sleep, truly." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though whether there were actual tears was a matter of some ambiguity. Jonathan, standing in the corner of the kitchen with his arms crossed over his chest, watched the performance with an expression of weary skepticism. He had never quite trusted his sister-in-law, though he could not have articulated exactly why. There was something about the way her eyes never quite matched her smile, something about the calculated timing of her visits, always when there was something to be gained, some advantage to be extracted from the relationship. But Margaret, exhausted and emotionally drained and desperate to believe in something good, saw only her beloved baby sister, the little girl she had protected from bullies on the playground, the teenager she had covered for when she snuck out to meet boys, the young woman she had stood beside at her wedding, beaming with pride. Margaret had always been Patricia's defender, her champion, her unconditional supporter. It was a role she had inhabited for so long that she no longer knew how to question it, even when the evidence of her sister's true nature was hiding in plain sight. And so, when Patricia began to speak of her connections, Richard's business partner knew the chief of surgery at the Seattle hospital, and she could make calls, pull strings, get Ethan moved to the top of the waiting list. Margaret listened with the desperate credulity of a mother who would grasp at any straw, believe any promise, trust any person who offered her son a lifeline. "You know how these big hospitals operate," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "They'll squeeze you for every penny if you let them. Hidden fees, inflated charges, tests you don't even need. It's criminal, really. But if you have someone on the inside, someone who knows how the system works." She trailed off, raising her perfectly shaped eyebrows meaningfully. "Richard and I were just saying the other night how much we want to help. Family takes care of family, right? That's what Mom always taught us." Margaret was weeping openly now, tears of gratitude streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Oh, Patty, I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You're an angel, a true angel. God sent you to us, I know He did." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "We appreciate the thought, Patricia. Really. But we've already got the money together. We just need to get Ethan to Seattle and—" "But that's exactly my point, John," Patricia interrupted, her voice bright with feigned enthusiasm. "You've done the hard part, raising the money. Now let me handle the logistics. I've been through this kind of thing before, when Richard's mother was sick. The paperwork alone is a nightmare. You need someone who can navigate the bureaucracy, talk to the right people, make sure nothing falls through the cracks." She turned back to Margaret, her expression softening into one of earnest concern. "Here's what I'm thinking. Why don't you let me hold on to the funds temporarily? Just for a few days, while I make the arrangements. I can set up a dedicated account, handle all the hospital deposits directly. That way, if there are any unexpected expenses, I can take care of them without bothering you. You just focus on Ethan. He needs his mother right now." The suggestion hung in the air, shimmering with apparent generosity. Jonathan opened his mouth to object. Something about the plan felt wrong, felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice that looked solid but might crack at any moment. But Margaret was already nodding, already reaching for the cashier's check on the table, already pressing it into her sister's perfectly manicured hands. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know what we'd do without you, Patty. You're saving our boy's life." Patricia folded the check and slipped it into her designer handbag with the practiced ease of a woman who had been handling other people's money her entire adult life. She kissed Margaret on both cheeks, promised to call first thing in the morning with an update, and swept out of the bungalow as quickly as she had arrived. The sedan pulled away from the curb, its engine purring smoothly, and Jonathan stood at the window watching the taillights disappear into the gathering dusk. A cold knot of unease had formed in his stomach, and he could not shake the feeling that he had just watched something precious and irreplaceable vanish into the night. He was right. That was the last time either of them would ever see Patricia Shaw or the money. The next morning, Margaret called her sister's number and got a disconnected tone. She tried Richard's phone with the same result. She called the construction company where Richard worked, only to be told by a confused receptionist that the Shaws had cleared out their office the previous afternoon. By noon, Jonathan had driven to their house, a handsome split level in the nicest suburb of the next town over, and found the front door hanging open, the room stripped bare, the closets empty, the drawers pulled out and abandoned. The neighbors, when questioned, said they had seen a moving truck pull up late the previous night, just as a thunderstorm was rolling in from the west. The Shaws had loaded everything of value and disappeared into the rain, leaving behind nothing but a few pieces of broken furniture and the faint, lingering scent of Patricia's expensive perfume. Jonathan stood in the empty living room, the rain pounding on the roof overhead, and felt something inside him fracture. It was not a clean break, but a slow, grinding crack, like a fault line opening in the earth. He had been a man of quiet, unshakable faith in God, faith in family, faith in the fundamental decency of the world. That faith had sustained him through lean years and hard winters, through disappointments and setbacks and the thousand small indignities of a life lived on the margins. But this was something else entirely. This was not a disappointment or a setback. This was an annihilation. His own sister-in-law, a woman he had welcomed into his home, fed at his table, trusted with his son's life, had stolen everything. She had taken not just the money, but hope itself, and in its place had left a void so vast and so dark that Jonathan could not see any way across it. He drove home through the storm, the windshield wipers beating a futile rhythm against the deluge, and when he walked through the door of the bungalow and saw Margaret's face, saw the dawning horror in her eyes as she registered the expression on his, he knew that their lives would never be the same. He told her, his voice flat and dead, and she collapsed onto the worn linoleum floor as if her bones had suddenly dissolved. She did not scream or wail or tear at her hair. She simply crumpled, folding in on herself like a flower wilting in fast motion, and she stayed there on the cold floor for a long time, her body shaking with silent, convulsive sobs. The hospital, when Jonathan called to explain what had happened, was sympathetic but firm. They were a business, after all, not a charity. Without payment, the surgery could not be scheduled. They could offer a payment plan, of course. Perhaps if the Fosters could come up with a 10% deposit, something could be arranged. But the full amount would still be required eventually, and the window for the procedure was closing. Every day that passed without intervention, Ethan's condition grew more precarious. The doctors had been clear on that point. Time was not on their side. The church tried to help. The community rallied again, organizing emergency fundraisers and taking up a second collection. But the well of generosity, so thoroughly drained by the first campaign, could offer only a trickle this time. A few $100s came in, then a few dozen, and then nothing at all. The news of Patricia's betrayal had spread through the town, and people were wary now, suspicious. Some whispered that the Fosters must have been naive, foolish to trust such a large sum to a relative. Others wondered aloud if the whole thing had been an elaborate scam from the beginning, with the Fosters as willing participants. The cruelty of small-town gossip, usually muted by familiarity and neighborly affection, now sharpened into something ugly and accusatory. Jonathan and Margaret, who had once been objects of sympathy, became objects of suspicion and then, gradually, objects of indifference. There were other tragedies in the world, after all. Other families in need. The Fosters had had their chance, and it had slipped through their fingers. Life moved on. But for Ethan, life did not move on, it deteriorated. The fever that had been controlled with medication now blazed out of control, sending his temperature soaring to levels that made the doctors shake their heads in grim silence. He was hospitalized twice, each time for longer stretches, each time with less hope of improvement. His small body, already thin, grew skeletal. His skin took on a grayish pallor and dark circles bloomed under his eyes like bruises. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams populated by strange, feverish visions, his mother's face, his father's voice, a woman with a beautiful smile who was somehow also a monster, her teeth sharp and dripping with something dark. He did not understand what had happened, not really. He was only 6 years old. All he knew was that something terrible had occurred, something that had made his parents cry in the night when they thought he was asleep, something that had transformed the hopeful, bustling energy of their little house into a mausoleum of grief and silence. By some miracle, or perhaps by some curse, depending on how one viewed it, Ethan survived. The fever eventually broke. His body, young and resilient despite the disease, mounted a partial recovery. But the damage had been done. The window for the surgery had closed, and the disease had entrenched itself in his system, settling into his organs like a squatter who could never be evicted. He would live, the doctors said, but he would never be healthy. He would face a lifetime of medication, of monitoring, of flare-ups and remissions, and the constant, gnawing anxiety that the next episode might be the one that finally broke him. He was alive, but he was not whole, and he would never be whole again. The betrayal of his aunt had not killed him, but it had condemned him to a life defined by what had been stolen from him. Jonathan Foster did not recover. Something essential in him had been extinguished on that rainy night when he stood in the empty shell of his sister-in-law's house and understood the full magnitude of what had been done to his family. He had always been a quiet man, but now he became almost mute, speaking only when necessary and in the fewest possible words. He went to work, performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, and came home to sit in his worn armchair, staring at the wall or at the photograph of Ethan as a healthy, laughing toddler that he kept on the side table. He did not eat enough. He did not sleep, or when he did, he slept too much, retreating into unconsciousness, as if it were a refuge from a reality he could no longer bear to inhabit. The doctors called it clinical depression, prescribed pills that he refused to take, recommended therapy that he refused to attend. Margaret tried everything, pleading, crying, shouting, silent treatment, desperate affection, but Jonathan had retreated to a place where she could not reach him. A cold and lightless inner landscape where hope was a foreign language and love was a memory too painful to revisit. A year after the betrayal, Jonathan Foster's heart stopped. The official cause of death was congestive heart failure, but Ethan, even at 7 years old, understood that his father's heart had not simply worn out from physical exertion. It had been broken, shattered, really, by the cruelty of a woman who had smiled and hugged and promised salvation while holding a knife behind her back. The betrayal had been a poison, slow-acting but inexorable, and it had worked its way through Jonathan's system until there was nothing left to destroy. At the funeral, Ethan stood beside his mother in a borrowed black suit that was too big for his thin frame, watching the casket descend into the frozen January ground, and he felt a coldness settle into his chest that would never entirely leave him. It was not just grief, it was hatred, pure and crystalline and absolute. He did not have a name for it yet, but it was there, taking root in the soil of his young heart, waiting to grow. Margaret Foster's decline was slower but no less devastating. The loss of her sister, not to death, but to a betrayal so profound that it felt like a kind of murder, had already cracked something in her mind. The death of her husband widened those cracks into chasms. She began to forget things, where she had put her purse, what day of the week it was, the names of her neighbors who stopped by with casseroles and pitying looks. At first, these lapses were attributed to stress and grief, the normal mental fog that accompanies profound loss. But as the months passed, the forgetting accelerated. She would wander out of the house in her nightgown and be found hours later, confused and shivering, blocks away from home. She would set pots of water on the stove to boil and forget about them until the water had evaporated and the metal was glowing red. She would look at Ethan, her own son, the child she had nearly died giving birth to, and see a stranger, her eyes clouding over with confusion and fear. "Where is my boy?" she would ask, her voice trembling. "Where is my little Ethan? Someone has taken him. Someone has taken my baby. The doctors diagnosed early-onset dementia, possibly triggered or accelerated by the trauma. There were medications that might slow the progression, care facilities that might provide a safe environment, but all of those options required money that the Fosters did not have and could not access. Margaret became a patient in the county hospital's psychiatric ward, a gray, institutional place that smelled of bleach and despair. Ethan visited her when he could, taking the bus across town and sitting beside her bed, holding her hand while she rambled about weather that wasn't happening and conversations that had never taken place. Sometimes she recognized him, and her face would light up with a love so fierce and so pure that it made his chest ache. More often, she did not, and he would sit there in silence, a stranger to the woman who had once been his whole world, and feel the hatred inside him grow a little larger, a little hungrier. On Ethan's 15th birthday, Margaret Foster died. She had been declining for months, her body as fragile as her mind, and in the end she simply slipped away, her breathing growing shallower and shallower until it stopped altogether. Ethan received the news from a social worker, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes who had seen too many tragedies to be surprised by any of them. She sat him down in a sterile conference room and explained, in gentle, bureaucratic language, that his mother was gone and that arrangements would need to be made. Ethan listened without expression, his face a mask of composure that belied the storm raging inside him. When the social worker asked if he had any questions, he shook his head. When she asked if he wanted to see his mother's body, he shook his head again. When she asked if there was anyone, any family member, any family friend, who might be able to take him in, he almost laughed. Family. The word was poison to him now, as toxic as the disease that still simmered in his blood. His family was dead, his father in the ground, his mother in the morgue. His aunt vanished into the vastness of a country that seemed perfectly designed to help predators escape the consequences of their crimes. The state offered foster care, and Ethan accepted it with the same numb resignation with which he had accepted every other misfortune that had befallen him. He was placed in a series of homes, some tolerable, most indifferent, a few actively hostile. He was fed enough to survive and clothed enough to avoid the attention of concerned teachers, but he was never loved, never nurtured, never made to feel that he was anything more than a burden. A problem to be managed until he aged out of the system and became someone else's responsibility. He lasted 6 months before he ran away. He packed a small bag with the few possessions he had left, a photograph of his parents on their wedding day, a pocket knife that had belonged to his father, a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo that he had stolen from the school library, and he slipped out of the Foster family's house in the middle of the night, disappearing into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. The years that followed were a masterclass in survival. Ethan hitchhiked to the nearest city, a mid-sized urban center with a river running through its heart and a network of bridges that offered shelter to the homeless and the forgotten. He slept under those bridges, wrapped in newspapers and discarded blankets, his body shivering through the cold Midwestern nights, while the traffic rumbled overhead like distant thunder. He learned to navigate the world of the invisible, the soup kitchens that served watery stew to long lines of ragged men and women, the shelters that offered a cot for the night if you arrived early enough, the alleyways behind restaurants where the dumpsters sometimes yielded half-eaten meals that were still warm. He learned which neighborhoods were safe to beg in and which ones would get you arrested or beaten. He learned to recognize the undercover cops who prowled the parks looking for vagrants to harass, the social workers who genuinely wanted to help but were bound by rules that made help impossible, the predators who saw a skinny 15-year-old with no family and no protection as easy prey. He took every job he could find, no matter how menial or degrading. He delivered newspapers in the pre-dawn darkness, his bicycle wobbling under the weight of the canvas bags, his fingers so numb with cold that he could barely grip the handlebars. He washed dishes in the back of a greasy diner, his hands submerged in scalding water for hours until the skin was raw and puckered and weeping. He hauled bricks and mixed cement on construction sites, his back screaming with every lift, his lungs filling with dust and asbestos and God knew what else. He worked as a janitor, a stock boy, a fry cook, a parking lot attendant, a warehouse loader, any job that would pay him in cash and not ask too many questions about where he came from or why a boy his age was working instead of attending school. He was often tired, frequently hungry, and perpetually, achingly alone. But he was also, against all odds, learning. The world of business, he discovered, was not as mysterious as it appeared from the outside. It operated according to patterns, rhythms, rules that could be observed and understood and eventually exploited. He watched the foremen on the construction sites negotiate with suppliers, noting how they leveraged relationships and information to get better prices. He watched the restaurant owners manage their books, observing which items were profitable and which were loss leaders, how pricing was set and adjusted, how customer complaints were handled and turned into loyalty. He read everything he could get his hands on, discarded newspapers, magazines fished out of recycling bins, library books checked out with a borrowed card from a sympathetic librarian who looked the other way. He taught himself accounting from a textbook he found at a yard sale, taught himself computer programming from manuals that were already obsolete by the time he got them, taught himself sales and marketing and negotiation by observing the world around him with the cold, calculating eye of a predator studying its prey. And every night, before exhaustion dragged him into the oblivion of sleep, he would allow himself one moment of pure, undiluted focus. He would close his eyes and picture Patricia Shaw's face, the arch of her eyebrows, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed. He would remember the sound of her voice, so warm and so false, and the way she had hugged his mother, knowing even as she did so that she was about to destroy her. He would feel the hatred rise in his chest, hot and sharp and clarifying, and he would make a silent vow, the same vow he had been making every night since he was 7 years old. One day, he would find her. One day, he would have power, real power, the kind that could move mountains and crush empires. And when that day came, he would make Patricia Shaw pay. Not just with money, though money would certainly be part of it, but with suffering. He would take from her everything she had taken from him and more. He would reduce her to the same state of desperate, animal need that she had condemned him to. He would make her watch as her world crumbled around her, just as his world had crumbled. He would be patient. He would be thorough. He would be merciless. And when it was over, when she was finally broken and alone and begging for a mercy that he had no intention of granting, he would remind her, in exquisite detail, of exactly what she had done to earn this fate. The vow became his sustenance, the fuel that kept his engine running when every rational impulse urged him to give up. Hatred, he discovered, was an inexhaustible resource. It did not flag or fade or lose its potency over time. If anything, it grew stronger, purer, more concentrated with each passing year. It was a flame that burned without consuming, a hunger that fed on itself and grew ever more ravenous. And it was, in the darkest moments, the only thing that kept him alive. 15 years passed, and the world changed around Ethan Foster in ways that would have been unimaginable to the shivering boy under the bridge. The dawn of the new millennium brought with it a technological revolution, a seismic shift in the way people lived and worked and communicated, and Ethan, by instinct, by observation, by sheer desperate hunger, positioned himself at the epicenter of the upheaval. He had saved enough money from his various jobs to buy a used computer, a clunky desktop machine that wheezed and groaned like an asthmatic, and he had spent countless nights in the public library, teaching himself to code in the glow of the fluorescent lights. The internet was still in its infancy then, a wild frontier populated by dreamers and schemers and visionaries, and Ethan recognized it for what it was, the greatest wealth creation engine in human history. A gold rush that would make the California prospectors look like children playing in a sandbox. He started small, as all great fortunes do. He built websites for local businesses, charging a few $100s for a service that would soon be worth thousands. He taught himself search engine optimization before the term even existed, figuring out through trial and error how to make a website appear at the top of the results page. He dabbled in e-commerce, buying products wholesale and selling them online, learning the intricacies of supply chains and customer acquisition and the strange alchemy that turned a casual browser into a committed buyer. He failed often, more often than he succeeded, in those early years, but each failure was a lesson, a data point, a refinement of the mental model he was building of how the business world actually worked. By his early 20s, Ethan had accumulated enough capital and enough knowledge to launch his first real venture, a small software company that developed custom inventory management systems for mid-sized manufacturers. It was not glamorous work, but it was profitable, and it gave him the foundation he needed to expand into adjacent markets. He hired his first employees, bright young programmers and ambitious salespeople who saw in Ethan a kind of intensity they had never encountered before, and began building the infrastructure that would eventually become Ether Technologies. The company grew in fits and starts, lurching from crisis to crisis, surviving on Ethan's sheer force of will and his almost preternatural ability to anticipate the next shift in the technological winds. When cloud computing emerged as the next big thing, Ether was there, ready with a suite of enterprise solutions that quickly became industry standards. When mobile technology exploded, Ether pivoted seamlessly, developing apps and platforms that captured the zeitgeist and the market share. When artificial intelligence began its march from science fiction to reality, Ether was at the vanguard, investing billions in research and development, poaching the brightest minds from Silicon Valley and beyond. By the time Ethan turned 30, Ether Technologies was a colossus, a sprawling empire worth $70 billion, with offices in 17 countries and a workforce of over 40,000 employees. The company's headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that rose 60 stories above the Seattle waterfront, had become a landmark, a symbol of the new economy and the new titans who dominated it. Ethan Foster himself had become something of a myth, the orphan who had risen from homelessness to unimaginable wealth, the reclusive genius who rarely gave interviews and never appeared at the glitzy industry events where his peers preened and networked. Business magazines ran breathless profiles of him, speculating about his personal life, non-existent, his hobbies, none that anyone could identify, and his plans for the future, shrouded in secrecy. He was courted by politicians, envied by rivals, and treated with a kind of odd deference by everyone who entered his orbit. He had everything that money could buy: a penthouse apartment with panoramic views of Puget Sound, a private jet, a collection of vintage cars he never drove, a wardrobe of bespoke suits that cost more than most Americans earned in a year. He had power, influence, respect. He had achieved the kind of success that would have seemed like a fever dream to the boy huddled under the bridge, counting the minutes until dawn. And yet, none of it filled the void. The wealth, the accolades, the corporate triumphs, they were all hollow victories, placeholders for a satisfaction that never arrived. Ethan would stand at the window of his corner office, looking out at the city that he had helped to shape, and feel nothing. The hatred that had driven him for so long was still there, coiled in his chest like a serpent that never slept, but it had become a cold, patient thing, not a fire but a permafrost, preserving the past in perfect, crystalline detail. He had not forgotten Patricia Shaw. He had not forgiven her. He had simply been waiting, biding his time, assembling the pieces of a vengeance that would be as complete and as devastating as his resources could make it. He had hired private investigators over the years, of course. Teams of them, the best that money could buy. They had tracked Patricia and Richard Shaw through a maze of aliases and shell companies, tracing their movements across state lines and business ventures. Richard had used the stolen $70,000, along with a generous helping of fraud and sharp dealing, to build Shaw Construction into a regional player, a mid-tier firm that specialized in municipal contracts and government projects. Patricia had reinvented herself as a pillar of the community in their new home in suburban Phoenix, volunteering for charities, hosting fundraisers, cultivating an image of benevolence that would have been laughable if it were not so monstrous. They had a daughter, Sophia, who had grown up in a bubble of privilege and opportunity, attending the best private schools, vacationing in Europe, earning degrees from prestigious universities. Every photograph that the investigators sent to Ethan, every report detailing the Shaw family's comfortable, prosperous existence, was a fresh wound. They were thriving while his parents rotted in the ground. They were living the American dream on a foundation of stolen hope. The injustice of it was a physical weight on his chest. He had tried, in his darker moments, to rationalize letting it go. He was a billionaire now. $70,000 was pocket change, a rounding error in his quarterly earnings. He could absorb the loss 1,000 times over and barely notice. But that was not the point, and he knew it. The money was never the point. The point was the principle, the cosmic imbalance that cried out for correction, the simple, irreducible fact that Patricia Shaw had destroyed his family and was walking free, unpunished and unrepentant, while his parents lay in unmarked graves. Justice, in any meaningful sense, had not been served. And Ethan Foster, who had built his entire life on the belief that the universe could be shaped to his will if only he worked hard enough and waited long enough, was not about to accept that some debts could never be collected. The opportunity he had been waiting for arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October, disguised as a routine HR memo about the search for a new chief operating officer. Ether Technologies was preparing to launch a major expansion into emerging markets in Southeast Asia and Africa, a strategic initiative that would require seasoned leadership and significant risk tolerance. The search committee had vetted hundreds of candidates and narrowed the field to 3 finalists, all of whom had impressive credentials and extensive international experience. Emily Parker, Ethan's executive assistant, a razor-sharp woman in her early 40s who had been with him for nearly a decade and knew his moods better than anyone, presented the finalists' resumes on a tablet, her voice crisp and professional as she walked him through the highlights. "The strongest candidate is Sophia Shaw," Emily said, swiping to the relevant file. Ivy League MBA, 2 Fortune 500 stints, led the Southeast Asian expansion for Omnitech. She's fluent in Mandarin and French, has a strong track record in emerging markets, and her references are impeccable. Honestly, I'm not sure what she's doing applying here instead of taking a C-suite role at a bigger firm, but she seems genuinely interested in the challenge. Ethan reached for the tablet, his fingers steady and his expression neutral, but something inside him had gone very still. The name Sophia Shaw had struck him like a physical blow, a jolt of electricity that traveled from his brain to his spine and set every nerve ending alight. He scrolled through the resume, his eyes moving methodically through the sections, education, experience, skills, achievements, until they landed on the family information field, a small box at the bottom of the digital form that most candidates filled out as an afterthought. Mother, Patricia Shaw. Father, Richard Shaw. The words seemed to pulse on the screen, radiating a dark energy that filled the room. Ethan's jaw tightened, the muscles bunching under his skin, and for a long moment he could not speak. The office, with its sleek modern furniture and its floor-to-ceiling windows and its panoramic view of the rain-swept city, seemed to recede into the distance, replaced by a flood of images from another time entirely, a cramped bungalow with a leaking roof, a cashier's check lying on a kitchen table, his mother's face crumpling with hope and gratitude, his father's suspicious silence, the empty house with the door swinging open in the storm. The memories crashed over him in waves, each one sharper and more painful than the last, and beneath them all was the hatred, the cold, patient hatred that had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. He looked at the photograph in the corner of the resume, and his breath caught in his throat. Sophia Shaw was beautiful, there was no denying it, but it was not her beauty that seized his attention. It was the familiarity of her features, the arch of her eyebrows, the curve of her lips, the intelligent, self-assured set of her jaw. She looked exactly like her mother. Not just similar, not just reminiscent, but eerily, unmistakably identical to the Patricia Shaw who had smiled and hugged and promised salvation while reaching for the knife. The resemblance was so striking that Ethan felt a surge of irrational fury, as if the woman in the photograph was Patricia herself, returned to mock him across the years. "She is innocent," a quiet voice whispered at the back of his mind. "She was a child when it happened." She did not choose her mother's sins. She does not even know what was done in her name. But the voice was drowned out almost immediately by another, louder and far more ancient. She is the fruit of the poison tree. Every privilege she enjoys, the education, the career, the confidence, the future, was purchased with your parents' blood. She may not have struck the blow, but she has worn the crown. She has lived the life that was stolen from you. Innocence is a luxury she cannot afford. Emily was still talking, her voice a distant murmur that barely registered. She's available immediately, and she's indicated a strong preference for working with a founder-led company rather than another corporate behemoth. Her salary expectations are within our range, and she's willing to relocate to Seattle. Should I schedule her interview for tomorrow morning? Ethan took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the storm inside him to subside into a controlled, focused intensity. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, betraying none of the chaos that had just swept through him. Yes, schedule her first. I'll conduct this interview personally. Emily raised an eyebrow. It was unusual for Ethan to involve himself in hiring at this level, but she knew better than to question his decisions. Of course, Mr. Foster. I'll make the arrangements. When she had left the office and the door had clicked shut behind her, Ethan turned his chair toward the window and stared out at the rain streaking down the glass. The city below was a blur of gray and silver, the buildings dissolving into the mist like ghost ships in a fog. His reflection in the window was pale and severe, his eyes dark with an emotion that he had long ago stopped trying to name. He was 30 years old, worth $70 billion, the master of an empire that spanned continents. He had climbed from the abyss to the summit, had remade himself from a starving orphan into a titan of industry. And yet, as he sat there in his corner office, surrounded by the trappings of unimaginable success, he felt as small and as helpless as the boy who had once huddled under a bridge, counting the seconds until dawn. The universe, in its strange and capricious way, had delivered him an instrument of vengeance. Sophia Shaw was walking into his life, completely unaware of the history that tethered them together, and Ethan Foster intended to use her as the weapon that would finally, after 15 years of waiting, bring Patricia Shaw to her knees. He would not be cruel for cruelty's sake. He was not a monster, despite what the hatred had done to him. Sophia Shaw, as an individual, had committed no crime. She had been a child, innocent, ignorant, blameless, when her mother had stolen his future. Ethan could acknowledge that, could even respect it on some abstract, intellectual level. But the cold calculus of justice demanded more than intellectual acknowledgement. Sophia had profited from the crime. She had eaten the fruit of the poison tree, had worn the clothes and attended the schools, and lived the life that his parents' death had paid for. Every advantage she possessed, every opportunity she had been given, was a direct transfer of wealth from his family to hers. The arithmetic was simple, brutal, and inexorable. She owed a debt, and he intended to collect. The plan, as it crystallized in his mind over the following hours, was elegant in its simplicity. He would hire Sophia Shaw. He would bring her into his organization, elevate her to a position of prominence and trust, make her dependent on his goodwill and invested in her own success. He would give her just enough rope to feel secure, just enough responsibility to feel important, just enough praise to feel valued. And then, when the moment was right, when she was fully committed, fully vulnerable, fully exposed, he would pull the rug out from under her. He would expose her family's crimes, dismantle her father's company, destroy her mother's reputation, and reduce everything the Shaws had built to rubble. And Sophia, the innocent beneficiary of all that stolen wealth, would have a front-row seat to the demolition. She would watch her world collapse, would feel the same helplessness and despair that he had felt as a 6-year-old boy lying in a hospital bed, waiting for a surgery that would never come. She would serve as the conduit through which the sins of the mother were visited upon the family, and in her suffering, Patricia Shaw would finally, after all these years, experience a fraction of the pain she had inflicted. It was not a perfect plan. There were risks, uncertainties, variables that Ethan could not control. Sophia might sense the trap and flee. She might prove to be more resilient than he anticipated. She might even, in some perverse twist of fate, earn his respect or his sympathy, complicating the cold calculus of his revenge. But Ethan had not built a $70 billion empire by shying away from risk. He had built it by embracing uncertainty, by acting decisively when others hesitated, by trusting his instincts even when the data was incomplete. And his instincts, honed over 15 years of waiting and watching and planning, told him that this was the moment he had been preparing for. The stars had aligned. The universe had delivered. And he would be a fool not to seize the opportunity with both hands. The following morning, Ethan arrived at his office early, the sun barely cresting over the Cascade Mountains to the east. He reviewed Sophia Shaw's resume one more time, memorizing every detail: her education at Columbia, her MBA from Wharton, her rapid ascent through the ranks at Omnitech, her fluency in 3 languages, her volunteer work with underprivileged youth. She was, by any objective measure, an impressive candidate. That only made the bile rise higher in his throat. Every line on her CV, every accomplishment, every skill, was a testament to the theft that had funded her life. She had been given every opportunity, and she had made the most of them. Good for her. But the opportunities themselves should never have existed. They were stolen goods, and the time had come to reclaim them. At precisely 9 o'clock, Emily Parker knocked on his door. "Mr. Foster, Miss Shaw is here for her interview." "Send her in." The door opened, and Sophia Shaw walked into the room, and for one disorienting moment, Ethan felt as though he had been transported back in time. She was taller than he had expected, with the lean, athletic build of someone who took her physical fitness seriously, probably a runner, he guessed, or perhaps a tennis player. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and her navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, the kind of understated luxury that signaled quiet confidence rather than ostentatious display. She moved with an easy grace, her heels making no sound on the thick carpet, and when she smiled, the expression was warm but not ingratiating, confident but not arrogant. She extended her hand, and her grip was firm and cool, the handshake of a woman who had navigated boardrooms on 3 continents and never once doubted her place in them. "Mr. Foster, it's truly an honor to meet you," she said, her voice clear and musical, carrying the faintest trace of an East Coast elite education. "I've followed Ether's trajectory for years. What you've built here is extraordinary." Ethan gestured for her to take a seat, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Thank you. Your resume is equally impressive. Columbia undergrad, Wharton MBA, 2 Fortune 500 roles. You've had quite the career." Sophia inclined her head, accepting the compliment with practiced modesty. "I've been fortunate. Good mentors, good timing, and a willingness to take on the projects that scare everyone else." She paused, her eyes meeting his with a directness that he had not expected. "I understand Ether is making a major push into Southeast Asia and Africa. Those are markets I know well. The challenges are significant: regulatory fragmentation, infrastructure gaps, talent scarcity, but the opportunities are enormous. I'd welcome the chance to help Ether navigate that terrain." The interview proceeded along conventional lines for the next 20 minutes. Ethan asked standard questions about her leadership philosophy, her approach to conflict resolution, her experience with cross-cultural team management, and her vision for market entry strategy. Sophia answered each query with poise and precision, drawing on concrete examples from her previous roles, demonstrating a depth of knowledge and a strategic acumen that was, Ethan had to admit, genuinely impressive. She was not just a polished resume. She was the real deal, smart, driven, and capable of the kind of analytical rigor that separated true leaders from mere managers. In another universe, in a world where her mother had not destroyed his family, Ethan might have hired her without hesitation and considered himself lucky to have her. But this was not that universe. And as the interview wound toward its conclusion, Ethan decided it was time to shift the ground beneath her feet. "Let me ask you something a bit more personal, Miss Shaw," he said, his voice casual, almost conversational. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. How do you define trust? And what do you believe is the appropriate consequence for someone who betrays it? Sophia blinked, the unexpected question catching her momentarily off guard. She recovered quickly, but Ethan saw the micro-expression, a flicker of confusion, a tightening around the eyes, that betrayed her surprise. That's a thought-provoking question for a job interview. I'd say trust is the foundation of any successful organization. It's built through consistency, transparency, and follow-through, and it can be destroyed in an instant by a single act of bad faith. As for consequences, I believe they should be proportionate to the breach, but also designed to restore the integrity of the system. It's not just about punishment, it's about rehabilitation and prevention. A very diplomatic answer, Ethan said, allowing a small, cold smile to touch his lips. Let me push a little further. In your view, should children be held accountable for the sins of their parents? Is there such a thing as inherited guilt? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sophia's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, and her fingers, which had been resting loosely on the arm of the chair, curled inward. I generally believe individuals should be judged on their own merits and actions, not on the actions of their ancestors. We don't choose our parents. But... She hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. I suppose there are situations where the lines become blurred. If someone benefits directly from a parent's wrongdoing and is aware of that benefit, they have a moral obligation to address it. Ignorance might explain an action, but it doesn't absolve it. Interesting, Ethan murmured. So awareness is the key. What if the beneficiary is genuinely unaware of the crime? What if they've spent their entire life believing their family's wealth was honestly earned, only to discover that it was built on the destruction of another family? Does the obligation to make amends arise only at the moment of discovery, or was it always there, latent, waiting to be activated? Sophia's face had gone very still. The confident, articulate executive who had walked into the office was gone, replaced by someone who was suddenly, viscerally aware that she was walking through a minefield without a map. Mr. Foster, I'm not entirely sure what you're driving at. Is there a specific scenario you have in mind? Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished surface of his desk, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. Let me be more direct then. Imagine a family, a young couple with a sick child. The child needs surgery to survive, and the parents, through years of sacrifice and the generosity of their community, managed to raise the necessary funds. They're on the verge of saving their son when a close relative, someone they trust implicitly, steals the money and disappears. The child misses the surgery. The father dies of grief. The mother loses her mind. The child becomes an orphan, homeless and alone, while the thief uses the stolen money to build a comfortable life for her own family. Her daughter grows up in privilege, attends elite schools, builds a successful career, and never knows the truth about where her advantages came from. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. Now, imagine that daughter is sitting in front of you, interviewing for a job. What would you say to her? Does she bear any responsibility for the crimes that made her life possible? Or can she simply claim ignorance and walk away, as if the suffering of the victims meant nothing at all? Sophia Shaw sat frozen in her chair, her face drained of color. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, charged with an energy that was almost electric. For a long moment, she could not speak. The question was no longer hypothetical. She understood that now, with a clarity that made her stomach clench and her heart race. Ethan Foster was not asking about abstract philosophy. He was asking about her. He was asking about her family. He was asking about something dark and terrible that she had never known, but that he clearly believed she should have. Her mind raced, grasping for context, for explanation, for anything that would make sense of the hostility radiating from the man across the desk. She thought of her mother's evasions over the years, the vague answers about the family's early days, the way conversations about money always seemed to veer into uncomfortable silence. She thought of the whispers she had overheard at family gatherings, the cryptic comments from distant relatives, the sense, never articulated but always present, that there was something in the family's past that no one wanted to discuss. She thought of the way her mother had reacted when she had mentioned Ethan Foster's name after the initial phone screening, the sudden sharpness in her voice, the uncharacteristic demand that Sophia withdraw her application. And in that moment, a terrible suspicion began to take root. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice quieter now, less certain, "I feel like there's something you're not telling me. If there's a history between our families, I'm not aware of it. But if there is, I would prefer that you speak plainly rather than through hypotheticals." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "You're right. I apologize for the theatrics. Let me be plain." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less intense. 15 years ago, your mother stole $70,000 from my parents. It was money they had raised to pay for a surgery that would have saved my life. Because of that theft, I never received the surgery. I have lived with the consequences of that every day since. My father died within a year. The stress and the grief destroyed him. My mother lost her mind and died a few years later. I was left alone, homeless, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a hatred that has kept me alive ever since. He delivered the words calmly, almost dispassionately, as if he were reading from a quarterly earnings report. But the weight of them, the sheer devastating magnitude of the accusation, hit Sophia like a physical force. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt her hands begin to tremble, felt the room tilt and spin around her. That's not possible. My mother would never. She's a good person. She volunteers. She donates to charity. She is a thief and a liar," Ethan interrupted, his voice hardening. "She smiled at my mother while she planned the theft. She hugged my father while she calculated her escape. She left me to die, and she used the money to build the life that you have enjoyed ever since. I have the records, Miss Shaw. Bank statements, witness testimony, a paper trail that leads directly from my parents' savings account to your mother's first real estate investment. I have spent 15 years assembling the evidence. There is no doubt, no ambiguity, no room for denial. Your mother destroyed my family. And you, whether you knew it or not, have been living on the proceeds of that destruction." Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet, as though everything she had believed about herself, her family, her life, was crumbling into dust. The confident, accomplished woman who had walked into this office had been an illusion, a carefully constructed fiction built on a foundation of lies. She was not a self-made success story. She was not the product of hard work and talent and the loving support of decent parents. She was the beneficiary of a crime, a parasite who had fed on the suffering of others and called it merit. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I swear to you, I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," Ethan said, and to his own surprise, he found that he meant it. The shock on her face, the horror in her eyes, they were not feigned. She had genuinely not known. But that, he reminded himself, was not the point. But ignorance, as you yourself said a few minutes ago, does not absolve responsibility. You have benefited from the crime. You have worn the clothes, attended the schools, built the career that my parents' death paid for. The debt is not yours alone, but you are part of it. And debts, in my experience, must be paid. Sophia stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What do you want from me? If you're going to ruin me, just do it. Don't drag it out." Ethan shook his head slowly. "I'm not going to ruin you, Sophia. Not yet. In fact, I'm going to do something that may surprise you." He picked up a pen from his desk and tapped it lightly against the polished wood. "I'm going to offer you the job. The COO position, with all the responsibilities and challenges that come with it. You're the best candidate for the role, regardless of your family history, and I'm not in the habit of letting personal feelings interfere with business decisions." Sophia blinked, her confusion evident. "Why would you do that? You just told me my mother destroyed your life. Why would you want me anywhere near your company?" "Because I want you to understand," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I want you to see, up close, what your mother's crime created. I want you to work beside me every day, to build something together, and to carry the knowledge of what your family did to mine. I want you to look at the children we helped through our charitable foundation and remember that I was once one of them and that your mother is the reason why. Consider it a form of restitution. Or consider it a punishment. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that you accept the offer and do the work. The rest will take care of itself. Sophia sat in silence for a long moment, her mind churning. Every instinct told her to flee, to walk out of this office and never look back, to put as much distance between herself and Ethan Foster as possible. But another part of her, the part that had always prided itself on facing challenges head-on, on never backing down from a fight, urged her to stay. If what Ethan said was true, and she had no reason to doubt it, then she did owe a debt. Running away would only confirm her family's cowardice. Staying, facing the consequences, might be the only way to begin to make amends. "All right," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll take the job. But I have conditions. I want to know everything, every detail of what my mother did, every piece of evidence you have. I want to understand the full scope of the damage. And I want the opportunity to make it right, in whatever way I can." Ethan regarded her with something that might have been respect, or might have been the cold, appraising gaze of a chess player who has just watched his opponent make an unexpected move. "Agreed. You'll have full access to the files. But be careful what you wish for, Sophia. Some truths, once known, cannot be unknown." "Then I'll learn to live with them," she said. "I've apparently been doing that my whole life without realizing it." The interview ended shortly thereafter, and Sophia walked out of the office on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The reception area was bright and bustling, filled with employees who smiled and nodded as she passed, and she returned their greetings with a mechanical politeness that required no conscious thought. It was not until she was alone in the elevator, descending toward the lobby, that she allowed herself to breathe a ragged, shuddering breath that was halfway to a sob. She leaned against the cool metal wall of the elevator car and closed her eyes, and behind her lids she saw a 6-year-old boy lying in a hospital bed, waiting for a surgery that would never come. That evening, she called her mother. "Sophia, darling. How did the interview go? I've been waiting all day to hear from you." Patricia Shaw's voice was bright and eager, the same honeyed tone she had used for as long as Sophia could remember. It was a voice that had soothed her childhood fears, celebrated her achievements, and offered unconditional support through every challenge she had ever faced. Now, listening to it, she felt only a cold, creeping dread. "The interview was interesting, Mom. The CEO, Ethan Foster, asked me a lot of strange questions. About trust. About betrayal. About whether children should pay for their parents' crimes." She paused, listening to the silence on the other end of the line. "He told me a story, Mom. About a woman who stole money from her own sister's family, money that was supposed to save her nephew's life. The nephew didn't get the surgery. His father died. His mother went insane. He ended up homeless, an orphan, while the thief used the money to build a comfortable life for herself and her daughter." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was different, tighter, higher, threaded with a panic that she was trying desperately to suppress. That's a terrible story. I don't know why he would tell you something like that. What a strange man. You should stay away from him, Sophia. Turn down the offer if they make one. We don't need his money. Come home." "Mom, do you know Ethan Foster? Did you know his family?" Because the story he told me, it sounded very specific. Very personal. And he looked at me like he knew me. Like he recognized something in my face. I don't know any Ethan Foster. It's a common name, for heaven's sake. You're being paranoid, Sophia. I forbid you to take that job. Do you hear me? I forbid it." Sophia's blood ran cold. In all her life, her mother had never spoken to her with such frantic, desperate authority. "Mom, what did you do? What happened 15 years ago?" "Nothing. I did nothing. I've been a good person, a good mother, a good wife. Don't you dare let some stranger poison your mind against me. I'm telling you, don't take that job." The line went dead. Sophia stared at her phone, her hand shaking, the city noise fading into a dull roar around her. She was standing on the precipice of a truth so devastating that it threatened to annihilate everything she had ever believed about herself. And yet, even in her terror, she felt a strange sense of inevitability. This was the reckoning she had somehow always sensed was coming, the shadow that had lurked at the edges of her charmed life, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. She called her father next, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, I need the truth. Who is Ethan Foster? And what did Mom do?" Richard Shaw's sigh was long and heavy, freighted with years of guilt and regret. "Sophia, I always knew this day might come. I should have told you years ago, but your mother, she was so afraid. She thought if we just kept quiet, if we just moved on and built a good life, the past would stay buried." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with shame. "Your mother made a terrible mistake a long time ago, before you were born. Her sister, your Aunt Margaret, had a little boy named Ethan. He was very sick, and the family had raised money for a surgery that could save his life. Your mother, she took that money. She was desperate, we both were, and she convinced herself that she was doing the right thing for our family. I didn't know until it was too late, and by then I was too weak, too scared to do the right thing. I've lived with that every day since." Sophia's knees buckled, and she sank onto a nearby bench, the world spinning around her. The little boy Ethan Foster, what happened to him? What happened to his parents? His father died within the year. Couldn't take the grief. His mother, she lost her mind, Sophia. She was institutionalized, and she died a few years later. Ethan was left alone. I heard he lived on the streets for a while, but then he disappeared. I never imagined he would become this, being a $70 billion titan who now held her entire future in his hands. Sophia closed her eyes, and the tears that had been threatening all day finally spilled over, tracking silently down her cheeks. Her entire life, the ballet lessons, the prep school tuition, the study abroad semesters, the Ivy League education, the connections, the confidence, all of it was stolen. She was a living monument to someone else's destruction, a walking, breathing testament to the cruelty of her own mother. "Dad, I'm going to take the job," she said, her voice cracking but resolute. "I don't know if I can ever make this right, but I have to try. Running away isn't an option anymore." Richard was silent for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "I understand. Just be careful, Sophia. Ethan Foster is not the same boy your mother hurt. He's become something else entirely. And I don't know if there's any mercy left in him." The following Monday, Sophia Shaw walked through the revolving doors of Ether Tower as the company's new chief operating officer. The building was everything she had expected and more, a soaring cathedral of glass and steel that seemed to touch the clouds, its lobby a vast atrium filled with natural light and the quiet hum of focused industry. Employees moved through the space with purpose and energy, their conversations a low murmur that echoed off the polished stone floors. Sophia collected her security badge from the front desk, rode the elevator to the executive floor, and stepped into a world that felt, from the very first moment, like a stage upon which a drama was about to unfold. The welcome reception was held in the executive conference room, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Department heads and senior managers gathered around a long table of polished walnut, their faces a mix of curiosity and professional courtesy. Ethan Foster stood at the head of the table, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, and when he spoke, his voice was warm and welcoming, the voice of a CEO who knew how to inspire loyalty and enthusiasm in his troops. Sophia Shaw comes to us with a formidable track record in international business development. Her expertise in emerging markets will be invaluable as Ether expands into new frontiers. She is exactly the kind of leader we need to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Please join me in welcoming her to the Ether family." He raised his glass, and the room echoed with polite applause. Sophia smiled and nodded, playing her part with the ease of long practice, but her eyes kept drifting to Ethan. His demeanor was impeccable, charming, professional, utterly convincing. But beneath the polished surface, she sensed the coiled tension of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Every word he spoke felt loaded with double meaning. Every gesture seemed calculated to remind her of the power he held over her. She was a pawn on his chessboard, and she knew it. The only question was how long it would take for him to make his move. Her first assignment arrived within the week, and it was, as she had anticipated, a trial by fire. Ethan summoned her to his office and laid out the details of the emerging market initiative, an ambitious expansion into Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, regions where Ether had no existing infrastructure and where the regulatory environments were legendarily complex. The budget was tight, the timeline was aggressive, and the expectations were stratospheric. Success would cement Ether's position as a global leader and add billions to its valuation. Failure would be a black mark on her record that no amount of spin could erase. I'm giving you full ownership of this project, Sophia. Your team, your strategy, your execution. The board will be watching closely, and so will I. I expect results. There was no warmth in his voice, no encouragement. Just the cold, hard expectation of a man who had clawed his way to the top and expected everyone around him to do the same. Sophia accepted the challenge without hesitation, throwing herself into the work with a ferocity born of equal parts ambition and desperation. She was determined to prove that she was more than the sum of her mother's sins, that her competence was real and hard-won, not merely a product of her tainted pedigree. She would succeed on her own merits, or she would fail trying. The following months were a blur of 18-hour days, transcontinental flights, and sleepless nights. Sophia built her team from scratch, handpicking a group of young, hungry analysts and experienced operators who shared her appetite for risk and her intolerance for mediocrity. She flew to Jakarta and Nairobi and Ho Chi Minh City, meeting with government officials and local partners, navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracies and the cultural nuances that could make or break a market entry. She pored over spreadsheets and legal documents until her eyes burned, negotiated contracts in 3 languages, and made decisions that affected millions of dollars with a confidence that she did not always feel. The work was grueling and often thankless, but it was also exhilarating, a chance to prove, to herself and to the world, that she was exactly as talented as her resume suggested. But Ethan Foster never let her forget the true nature of their relationship. He had a gift for the casual cruelty, the offhand remark that seemed innocuous on its surface, but carried a hidden barb that cut to the bone. Once, during a budget review, he glanced at her expense report and said, without looking up, "You're very comfortable spending large sums of money, Sophia. I suppose that's a family trait." Another time, during a strategy session, he remarked that her proposals were aggressive and perhaps a little too optimistic about the returns on other people's investments. The words were delivered with a smile, but the meaning was unmistakable. He was reminding her, at every opportunity, that her success was built on a foundation of theft, that every dollar she managed for Ether was a dollar that should have belonged to his family. The psychological torment reached its apex when Ethan announced, with great fanfare, the launch of a new charitable initiative, the Starfire Scholars Program, a scholarship fund for children who had lost their parents to illness or tragedy. "This is a cause that is very close to my heart," he said at the press conference, his voice dripping with sincerity. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to face a future that seems utterly hopeless. The Starfire Scholars Program is my way of ensuring that other children don't have to suffer as I did." He paused, and his eyes, for just a moment, flicked toward Sophia, who was standing at the back of the room. "And I'm pleased to announce that our new COO, Sophia Shah, will be serving as the program's executive sponsor. She has a deep personal commitment to helping the disadvantaged, and I know she will bring the same passion and dedication to this role that she brings to everything she does." The room applauded. Sophia smiled and nodded, accepting the appointment with every appearance of enthusiasm. But inside, she felt like she was drowning. She knew exactly what Ethan was doing. The Starfire Scholars Program was a mirror, a reflection of his own childhood tragedy, and by placing her at its helm, He was forcing her to confront, every single day, the reality of what her mother had done. She would meet children who reminded her of the boy Ethan had been: bright, hopeful, terrified, abandoned by a world that should have protected them. She would hear their stories, see their faces, and know that her family was responsible for creating more children just like them. It was, in its way, a punishment more exquisite and more devastating than any prison sentence could have been. And yet, to her own surprise, Sophia found that she was good at the work. More than good, she was passionate about it. The children she met through the program touched something deep inside her, something that had been buried under years of ambition and privilege and willful blindness. She visited schools in low-income neighborhoods, met with families who had been devastated by medical bills and job losses and the 1,000 other calamities that can destroy a household. She listened to their stories, held their hands, and felt, for the first time in her life, a sense of purpose that transcended quarterly earnings reports and market share metrics. The Starfire Scholars became her mission, her obsession, her reason for getting out of bed in the morning. She convinced Ethan to triple the program's endowment. She created mentorship networks, tutoring initiatives, and summer enrichment camps. She personally mentored several of the older scholars, helping them with college applications and career advice, and she wept openly at their graduations, overwhelmed by a pride that felt almost maternal. In helping these children, she was, in some small way, atoning. It was not enough, it could never be enough, but it was something. And as the months passed, she began to notice a shift in Ethan's demeanor toward her. The casual cruelties became less frequent. The barbed remarks gave way to a wary, grudging respect. He still watched her with those cold gray eyes, still held the sword of Damocles over her head, but there was something different in his gaze now, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity, or might have been the first tentative stirrings of forgiveness. The turning point came on a gray December afternoon, nearly a year after Sophia had joined Ether. Ethan had called her into his office for what she assumed was a routine project update, but when she arrived, she found him standing at the window, his back to the door, his silhouette framed against the low winter sky. He did not turn when she entered, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I've been watching you, Sophia," he said finally, his voice quiet and contemplative. "All these months. I expected you to break. I expected you to show the same weakness, the same moral rot as your mother. Instead, you've done something I didn't anticipate." He turned to face her, and his expression was different than she had ever seen it, less guarded, less calculating, almost vulnerable. "You've made the Starfire Scholars into something real. Something that actually changes lives. The children you've helped, they remind me of myself once. And you've given them a chance that I never had." Sophia stood very still, her heart pounding. She did not know where this was going, but she sensed that something important was happening, something that had been building for a long time. "Those children deserve every chance we can give them. They're innocent. They didn't choose their circumstances." "No," Ethan agreed. "They didn't. Just like you didn't choose your mother's crimes. Just like I didn't choose to be orphaned and homeless at 15. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. "I've spent half my life hating your family, Sophia. It was the only thing that kept me alive, the only fuel that got me through the worst years. I thought that when I finally had my revenge, when I had crushed your mother and destroyed everything she built, I would feel whole. I would feel peace. But I don't feel whole. I feel tired. And maybe a little ashamed of how much I've enjoyed watching you squirm." Sophia met his gaze, her own eyes steady. "I'm not going to apologize for my mother. She did something unforgivable, and I've spent this year trying to come to terms with that. But I am sorry, truly sorry, for what you suffered. And I'm grateful that you gave me the chance to do something, however small, to make amends." Ethan was silent for a moment. Then, very slowly, he extended his hand. "I think it's time we stopped being enemies, Sophia. I'm not saying I've forgiven your mother. I don't know if I ever will. But I've watched you work, and I've seen her when no one is looking. You're not her. You're not defined by her sins. And I hope, that there's a way forward for both of us that doesn't involve destroying each other." Sophia stared at his outstretched hand, her mind reeling. This was not the ending she had expected. She had braced herself for ruin, for disgrace, for the complete annihilation of everything she had worked to build. Instead, she was being offered something that felt impossibly like grace. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and warm. "I'd like that, Ethan. I'd like that very much." In the weeks that followed, an uneasy but genuine peace settled between them. They continued to work together, driving Ether's expansion and growing the Starfire Scholars Program into one of the most respected educational nonprofits in the country. Sophia learned to see Ethan not as a predator or a monster, but as a profoundly wounded man who had spent his life building walls around a heart that had been shattered when he was 6 years old. And Ethan, in turn, began to see Sophia as more than just a pawn or a proxy for her mother's sins. She was a woman of genuine integrity, someone who had been dealt a terrible hand by fate and had chosen to play it with grace and courage. The final act of the drama came when Sophia, after months of delicate negotiations, convinced her mother to meet with Ethan in person. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a quiet conference room at a hotel near the airport, stripped of any associations with either family's territory. Patricia Shaw, now in her late 60s and visibly diminished by the years of guilt and fear, walked into the room on her daughter's arm, her face pale and her hands trembling. Ethan was already there, standing by the window, and when he turned to face her, Patricia let out a small, choked sob. "Ethan, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I've been sorry every day for 15 years. I know that doesn't change anything, but—" "Stop," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here for an apology. I came here to tell you that I'm letting go. Not forgiving, I don't know if I'm capable of that. But letting go. I've carried this hatred for so long that it's become a part of me, and I'm tired of being defined by what you did. I want to be defined by what I do next. And what I do next is going to be about building, not destroying." He looked at Sophia, who was standing slightly apart, her eyes wet but her expression composed. "Your daughter has spent the last year working to make amends for your crimes. She's helped hundreds of children because of what she learned about you. I think that counts for something. I think it counts for a lot." Patricia Shaw wept great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She tried to speak, to offer some explanation or justification, but the words would not come. In the end, she simply nodded, her head bowed, and allowed her daughter to lead her out of the room. The Starfire Scholars Gala that spring was the largest and most successful in the program's history. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel was filled to capacity, the tables crowded with donors and dignitaries and, most importantly, the scholars themselves. Young men and women whose lives had been transformed by the opportunities the program had provided. Ethan Foster took the stage to thunderous applause, his tuxedo immaculate, his demeanor confident but somehow softer than it had been in years. "I started this program as an act of anger," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the vast room. "I wanted to prove something to the world, to my enemies, to myself. But somewhere along the way, the anger gave way to something else. Hope, I suppose. Or maybe just the realization that the best answer to cruelty is not more cruelty. The best answer is compassion. The best answer is building a world where the kind of tragedy that befell me doesn't happen to anyone else." He paused, and his eyes found Sophia in the front row, seated beside her mother. Patricia Shaw, gray-haired now and dressed in a simple navy dress, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes glistening. "I want to thank my COO, Sophia Shaw, for her tireless work on behalf of the Starfire Scholars. She has been, in ways she probably doesn't fully understand, my teacher. She has shown me that redemption is possible, that the past does not have to define the future, and that even the deepest wounds can heal if you let them." The applause was deafening. Sophia rose from her seat, acknowledging the recognition with a modest nod, but her eyes were fixed on Ethan, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a truce. Perhaps even the first fragile stirrings of a friendship that might one day transcend the darkness from which it had emerged. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the ballroom had fallen silent, Ethan stood alone on the hotel terrace, looking up at the stars. The spring air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms from the nearby park. He had spent 15 years climbing a mountain of rage, and now, at the summit, he found not triumph but release. The hatred that had sustained him for so long was gone, and in its place was something new, a lightness, a possibility, a sense that the rest of his life was finally his to live. "Ethan?" Sophia's voice came from behind him, soft and hesitant. She stepped onto the terrace, her wrap pulled tight against the evening chill. "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. For giving me a chance when you had every right to destroy me." Ethan turned to face her, and for the first time in 15 years, he smiled, not the cold, calculating smile of a predator, but a genuine expression of warmth and connection. "I should be thanking you, Sophia. You reminded me that I'm more than my past, that I'm capable of more than revenge." He extended his hand, and she took it, her grip steady and sure. "Let's see what we can build together. A future that neither of us has to be ashamed of." Sophia nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd like that." The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, as two people who had been shaped by the same tragedy stood together on the terrace and watched the city lights flicker in the darkness below. The debt, if it could ever truly be repaid, had been addressed in the only currency that mattered, not money but mercy. The cycle of vengeance had been broken. And in its place, something new was beginning to grow, fragile, tentative, but unmistakably alive.